Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Alexander Lashley. For as little as $3 you can gain access to Patreon only episodes as well as access to our Discord server where we host weekly live discussions with host Ikoi Hero and myself. So if you like what you hear, come join us at patreon.com/it's not just in your head. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email it's not just in your head @gmail.com.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
We are fortunate enough to have Jenny Brown talking with us today after her amazing book about abortion. And it brings up quite a few questions. One is, why are American women being denied control over one of the basic systems of our bodies at this moment? What's going on here and what to do about it? I wonder what your thoughts are about why now. We've had Roe versus Wade and permission to have abortions, and 1 in 4 American women has had an abortion, and we felt we didn't have to be incubators for male sperm, and now that is changing, and 6 unelected people with right-wing convictions are taking that right away. And it makes me wonder why, since by your own statistics, the overwhelming majority of Americans support abortion rights, how are they getting away with this now? What's going on?
Well, thanks, Harriet. That's a great question, and thanks for having me, everybody. So I think something that we were not aware of when we did win the abortion rights that we got under Roe and some of the state laws that we got preceding Roe, like in New York State, I think we were not really aware that we had the wind at our back in the sense that the birth rate had stayed quite high after World War II, and the ruling class was split on the question of abortion and birth control rather remarkably. Like the Republicans, for example, in New York State, the abortion repeal act was sponsored by a Republican. So why were they split on it? Well, the high birth rate was something that they were complaining about. They complained, oh, women are having all these children, they're filling the welfare rolls. Why can't they just keep their legs closed? All of this really sexist stuff. And then, and at the same time, the main opposition at the time was the Catholic Church, which basically had its various, a lot of arms trying to keep the laws the same or even make them more strict. So we didn't have a huge evangelical movement opposing abortion at that point. We basically had Republicans who were split about the question of whether abortion and birth control should be available. And they were complaining also that, the population bomb meant that crime and overcrowding in the cities, rebellion, they even blamed communism on burgeoning population. So they were very concerned about this. Well, fast forward to now, we have the lowest birth rate on record in the United States at 1.64 children per woman. And this has really been a trend that Europe has been ahead of us on, and Japan. And economists in the U.S., including, people who are generally regarded as liberal, like Larry Summers and Paul Krugman, have been pointing at Japan's economic stagnation for the last 20 years and saying, well, see, this is what happens when you have a birth rate so low that your population starts to decline, which started happening in Japan in the early 2000s. So they're very concerned about what this will do to economic growth. It's really the first time that capitalism has encountered this problem. So that's one area. And then the other area that they're constantly talking about is the age ratio, which basically is the number of children versus the number of retired people. And they are worried that if they can't really cut back our retirement and our Social Security, if we don't have larger families on whom we can then depend when we get to retirement age. So they really want to dump the expense and support of retired people and people who are past their working age onto back into the family. But they can't do that if we're having such small families. So that is, and usually that's pitched as, the demographic crisis, a demographic time bomb. The entitlement programs are being burdened by all these old people, right? And basically just a disrespect for people who have worked their whole lives to make somebody else rich and now have nothing to show for it, and they don't even want to give us the dignity of a retirement. So that's those are the two main worries. Now, functionally, why are we facing this? I think one of the reasons we're facing it just sort of is the dysfunction of our government right now, which essentially is allowing the Supreme Court to legislate. And so we've had all of these cases that have had really profound effects on democracy in the U.S., including the Citizens United, which basically allowed unlimited cash to flow into political campaigns, getting rid of the safety net for voting in the South, which basically in Shelby versus Holder, where essentially they are now allowing Southern states to return to kind of pseudo Jim Crow type policies, and basically making it more difficult for anybody to vote, which skews it to richer people, and then making right to work throughout the public sector. All of these things, which weakens unions in the public sector, and now abortion, right? Mm-hmm. And for that matter, just recently, the EPA cannot regulate greenhouse gases. But what has been the legislative response to any of these things over the last 15 years? We haven't had any legislative response because the Senate has this filibuster bill. So the filibuster rule means that any 41 senators can stop anything. And the Senate itself is so undemocratic because, 2 senators from Wyoming, 2 senators from California with, 40 times the population, right? So we have this situation where we're being legislated to by this, as you point out, this very right-wing, tiny group of people who have, are appointed for life. And we have no legislative response possible. So that's another why are we in this situation.
Right. Because if I think about the family that will result from not allowing abortions, it will be like what I would call the fascist feudal family in Nazi Germany, where women were considered inferior, in charge of kitchen, church, and children, where their job was to be subordinate and take care of men and children and home. And they were not allowed to use birth control. They were not allowed to have children. They also had to work in the munitions factories, but were paid less because actually that wasn't their true mission. And ironically, they didn't have more kids because they were so wiped out from having all those jobs. But that was the family of Nazi Germany. And I think that's how they want to solve America's contradictions with an authoritarian state. Because, Hitler promised to make Germany great again, too, with an authoritarian state, with male supremacy, and with women as wombs and domestic laborers. And yet, I think a lot of white men miss the time when they were great before because they had a family wage that controlled their wife and children. And some women also feel a terrible loss because they lost protection for life. When you got married, you did all the domestic labor, you connected your guy with his friends and relatives, you produced and took care of children, you took care of the house, you took care of his emotional needs, and you were supported economically for life. And they've lost that position. So a lot of Americans are feeling loss, which could be compressed into a fascist program, or no, we deserve better. And I think that the abortion decision by these unelected right-wingers is trying to push women back into a fascist, not really back into a fascist family, because it used to be that as long as you were white and in a family headed by a male, if you got married, you would be supported for all your domestic, emotional, and social labor. So that's what I think is their agenda. Sorry, Liam.
Yeah, no, it's all good. So is it very much a deliberate decision about population numbers, and that essentially we need more people to be the workers, be the soldiers, and the abortion laws get in the way of that end?
Yes, but I also think that it's a way of juicing a movement that America used to be great. And if we reenact the restrictions that we used to have, it will again be great. If we just reinstitute Jim Crow and discriminate against Black people and keep women in their inferior place, then America will be great again. And they don't want to face that the American century is over.
Yeah, am I right in thinking that Roe versus Wade had problems to begin with because it was based on not really on women's rights but more on privacy? Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean the thing about Roe is that it was very much a compromise with what the movement wanted. The movement wanted free abortion on demand, so the free part becomes much more important as medical costs rise. But it was always important because abortions, initially costed when they were first legal in New York, costed $200. So that wasn't easily available to pretty much anybody. Now, briefly, the Medicaid did cover abortions nationally from 1973 to 1976, and a lot of people availed themselves of that. 300,000 abortions a year. So a lot of people needed abortions that they were getting at that point, and that was stopped under Carter. Carter signed the Hyde Amendment initially. It was an issue in the election. Ford staked out a position against it. Carter was for it, and this basically banned any federal funding for abortion. So that meant that we really had no right to abortion. We merely had the right to go out into the private market and attempt to purchase one. Yeah, so that, and you can see like the contrast with Argentina, which just won legalized abortion in 2020, right? Their law says that within 10 days, if you're requesting an abortion, the health system has to provide it to you. Like, that's sort of the opposite of ours, where you have to have a waiting period, right? So, and the movement wanted it to be 5 days. They didn't win that, but they won it in 10 days. So that sort of shows what an abortion right would actually look like if we had won it in the U.S. But we never really won the right. What we won was the ability for the states were basically prohibited from putting in certain restrictions, and then as the Supreme Court decisions have piled up, they've allowed more and more restrictions, to the point where there are so many restrictions in some of the southern states. Even before the Dobbs decision, it was very difficult for a lot of people to get abortions. And so I think when we look at this, we should say, well, we don't want to go back to 2021 on abortion law. We really want to go forward and make it a national right through a national health care system, Medicare for all, whatever you want to call it, where everybody has the right to all the health care they need. That is really how we can get reproductive rights in reality, including contraception, which is also quite expensive.
Yeah, it's very important because I think what you had in Argentina, which where they won abortion in spite of the Pope making an in-person visit to his birthplace to try to get them to vote against abortion, is they had that kind of unity of the indigenous movement, the socialist movement, the feminist movement, the Black rights movement, the climate movement, all supporting them. And I think in 1973, we had a de facto coalition because the riots were happening starting in 1968. They also had a very unpopular war in Vietnam that people were demonstrating against. And they really couldn't afford to have millions of women out there demanding the right to abortion as well and being dissatisfied. So I think they felt they had to give. And I don't think they feel that now because there isn't a unity on the left, even de facto, the way they used to be. And the way they have been. Sorry.
The other factor there is, of course, you had the entire socialist world with abortion legal and free, in government hospitals, right? You could go and get it, including Poland, where it's now completely illegal. So people could go behind the Iron Curtain for freedom, right? So that really was really embarrassing and just added to the pressure on the U.S. government to do something. Meanwhile, we had whole wards of people with botched abortions, dying or terribly injured. Whereas you could get a free legal abortion in a hospital in Moscow.
Yeah, that's true. That competition made them give a lot more than they would have. And I think that if we are to win these rights back, we have to make a coalition of all people who are deprived of their rights, which is an awful lot of people in the United States, including the climate movement being deprived of the right to live. But that would have to happen on the left the way it did in Chile and in Argentina and also in Colombia, that in South America.
Sorry, Harriet, I just want to pick up on that sort of the observation you made just then and in the book, this idea that there's a difference in sort of birth rate between capitalist nations and, previously socialist nations and how they changed over time. I don't know if you could talk about that a bit because, yeah.
So what I observed is that with a couple of exceptions, so all the socialist countries made abortion legal shortly after they won. This was true in Vietnam. It was true in Korea. It was true in Cuba,
Russia.
It didn't matter. The Soviet Union was the first, and so you have to ask, okay, why was that? Well, first of all, they believed in equality, and in the Soviet Union, certainly there was a lot of there were a lot of laws passed for women to have equality, but they also believed that women had contributions to make other than just as mothers, right? So they tried to make it easier for people to have babies and put a lot of resources into maternity care and creches and laundries and cafeterias to get housework out of the home and basically lighten the burden on people so that they could do other things, right? And in Vietnam, you also see that they had this plan, which was to lighten the burdens on women workers so that they could do other things than just raise kids. And one of the parts of that was to give them control over reproduction. So that was an ideological thing. And then, but then the other thing is, and you see it in China, right, which went from position of having a one-child policy to slowly loosening that to a two-child policy, and now they're really actually trying to encourage births. The one-child policy came in as part of the Deng Xiaoping reforms in 1979. And what their stated reason for it was, and by the way, it was one child if you were urban, if it was two children if you were rural, and if you were a national minority, you could have three children because those were oppressed groups. And they brought it in because they felt that the gains that they were making from development were basically getting spread out too much among this burgeoning population that they had, and they wanted to consolidate those gains of development and basically have each person have more stuff, right? So that's only a situation that you can have in a socialist country where they're actually sharing stuff out, right? So that was the stated reason for the policy. And as capitalism has been restored and more of China has basically become capitalist, they have realized that they need to feed the needs of these corporations for workers. And so that's why they have loosened these policies. And also you see this in Russia. So in the Soviet Union, abortion was made legal between 1921 and 1936. In 1936, abortion was outlawed under Stalin's changes because they were afraid, here was Hitler saying he was going to annex parts of Russia. In Mein Kampf, he talks about how he's going to annex parts of Russia. They were under attack from every European country. Basically, send troops, and the U.S. sent troops into the Soviet Union trying to overthrow the government. So for military reasons, they got rid of that. Then in '54, they restored it in the post-war period. They restored abortion rights and basically had full abortion rights up until the overthrow of communism. Now, after that, they started to work. There was an incredible drop in the birth rate because living conditions got so bad when the looting of the state happened and basically the oligarchs took over. And living conditions were so terrible. The death rate went up drastically. And the birth rate went down drastically. And so now it has become a theme of the Russian state to try to raise the birth rate. And every year, Vladimir Putin gives speeches about how we have to raise the birth rate. And they have also put enormous amounts of money into cash support for mothers. So that's their preferred way of doing it. And that's raised the birth rate slightly. But you can see that now they're very concerned about the birth rate, whereas during the socialist period, it was not really an issue. All that post-war period, it was birth rate was around 2.1, around replacement. Nobody was freaking out that there weren't enough people to man the factories. Nobody was freaking. It was not an issue. Whereas in the U.S., when we have a around replacement or below replacement birth rate, or in China with capitalism restored, they're very worried about that. So I think now there are cases of horrible reproductive coercion and Romanian orphanages and all this stuff. But for the most part, in socialist countries, they have a much better record on first of all on contraception and reproductive rights in general. Partly because they're willing to go up against the church, but also there's not this massive need to create profit opportunities through the growth of the system in general, which has relied primarily on population growth since the inception of the system. Populations have been growing. So I think that's an interesting contrast to make and to say, okay, what is it about capitalism that requires us to have births at baby boom rates in order for the system to continue and to not stagnate? So that's a question that we should be asking.
Well, I also think that right now, what's happening is that they have exported a lot of the good jobs overseas. And we've gone from a manufacturing economy to a service economy. And women and men's wages have become more equal, not because men's wages improved, but they stagnated. And so women now make 82% on average of what men make. But people are rejecting shit jobs now. 20 million people dropped out of the labor force during the pandemic because they were being exploited, underpaid, and told they were essential. And the contradiction was just too much. And so I think what's happening is also they kicked out the immigrants who used to wash dishes for almost nothing in an oppressive environment. So between getting rid of the immigrants who took the shit jobs and were underpaid, and people refusing the shit jobs where they were underpaid, and a massive unionization across the United States, unlike anything that was seen before except in the 30s, they're getting nervous and they want to have a lot of cheap shit labor. And these neglected, unwanted children with inadequate upbringings would be the dishwashers of tomorrow without allowing immigrants to come in. And the low-page clickers in the grocery stores and so on. So I think they want to replenish the bottom of the labor force that they don't allow in because of immigrants and because they underpaid people so terribly and told them they were essential. People are refusing.
In all these examples of control, historic and present, I think one of the things that, one of the stats that was really interesting in your book was that 25 to 30% of women are going to need abortions, whether it's legal or illegal. So these forms of social control, it's questionable how much they sort of quote unquote work for their particular ends, given that, it's very similar to the drug policy stuff. When we spoke to, was it Carl Eric Fisher? Was that his name?
Yes.
When he was talking about, when they try and ban substances, all it does is it just drives it underground. Like there's still just the same amount of demand for stuff. So there's a sort of lunacy to trying to control everyone, right?
It's interesting because I was just reading this American Enterprise Institute report from 2018, which is all about the declining fertility, right? So this is a right-wing think tank that has been promoting capitalist interests, and the report, first of all, it has empty bassinets on the front cover, right? And they, so it's by this guy named Lyman Stone, and he mournfully says, well, these even really strict laws making abortion and contraception illegal are probably not going to raise the birth rate by more than about 5%. What we really need is to sort of change the culture. And he points to the former Soviet state of Georgia as an example, where the head of the church there has said you must have children, and they have all this. Basically, there's a lot of propaganda around it that your role is to have children, whatnot. So we could see some of these bans and the crackdown on contraception as which is also another aspect of this, and we're going to see more of that if the Supreme Court decision is any indication. But I mean, even under Trump, like half of the Title X family planning visits evaporated. Like those policies really made it hard to get contraception. So when you ban contraception and abortion, it may not raise the birth rate much, but this sort of culture of disapproving of abortion, disapproving of contraception, trying to get people to to identify themselves, somewhat as Harriet was saying, with their ability to produce children and the family, and sort of enclosing, getting rid of other options for women and enclosing them back into the family to make that basically the only option that you have, I think very much is on their agenda. And they're hoping, through a combination of making these things illegal and disapproving of them and all this religious propaganda and other propaganda. This particular American Enterprise Institute guy, Lyman Stone, is big into his big thing is promoting marriage, how great marriage is, and this is part of his idea of like if people get married, then they'll have kids, which I think he's got the causation wrong.
Right.
People get married because they're planning on having kids, but there's definitely a correlation, and he thinks if we can just force and discriminate against women enough to make the family the best option for them, then maybe we can force them into raising the birth rate. And Pat Buchanan, former Nixon speechwriter and various right-wing presidential candidate at various points, who claims to be responsible for, as he says, running the sword through childcare under the Nixon administration. His whole thing is, that we have to discriminate against women more vigorously. And so that, he believes that the equal pay was, a siege gun against the West. He talks about this. He also calls contraception the suicide tablet of the West, right? So he's very much into this racist replacement theory stuff, but his idea is if you bring back discrimination against women in jobs, then they will be forced back into dependence on husbands who will then have power over them, and then they will, what Harriet was saying, force you back into the family, and that will be the only way that you can fulfill yourself is through having kids. So, I think it's I think the banning abortion and contraception, while they might not immediately have effects on the birth rate, although I have to say that banning contraception in parts of Texas where in 2011 there was massive cuts in contraception funding, and there was a whole area where there were no clinics anymore. The birth rate went up 27%. So it may be that they can actually force this through abortion. Not so effective as we can see from, for example, Poland, which still has one of the world's lowest birth rates, despite having banned abortion. But when you get rid of access to contraception, that can be, I think, a little more effective than even this American Enterprise Institute guy thought. But at the same time, it's part of a whole plan of enclosing people back and forcing the expenses of having kids back into the family and back onto our strained wages. That's kind of the agenda for it's not just a high birth rate agenda, but it's also who's going to pay for it agenda. And the agenda around that is that any expenses have to be borne by the family. Out of our paycheck. It's not going to be guaranteed. It's not going to be paid publicly.
Yeah, one of the problems with that, though, is they've wanted to push women back into the situation of the 50s without pushing back the conditions of existence of that family, which were a family wage for the white male. And
exactly.
So they could have the fascist family where they have women forced to work and also forced to subordinate themselves to their husbands, but then they're so exhausted they can't have children, which is what happened in Nazi Germany. The birth rate didn't go up as planned because women couldn't conceive it. They were too wiped out.
Yeah, I mean, the crisis, they're facing this crisis on all these different levels, and basically the idea of the family wage, which is sexist in all the ways that we just described, but at least it meant that corporations were providing some resources for raising a family, right? But now we are completely on our own, where both parents are working. They're getting 80 or more hours a week out of a couple, and there's no resources for raising the kids. There's the family job, which used to be paid by the man's, in the ideal, good union job situation where the man's wage paid for the kids and for a spouse to do all the care work. We don't have that anymore, right? So so that's created the crisis within the family, and what has resulted is people are just having fewer kids. I mean, in my group, people were saying, well, I wanted to, but I just decided to stop at one. I can't, it's too much. I can't do it with the time, the expense, the childcare expenses, the lack of reliable health care, no time off at work. I mean, it's just too much. So, and then many people are deciding not to have any kids. So that's kind of where the struggle is expressing itself is in this low birth rate, which we're calling, in my group, we call it a spontaneous birth strike, using an early 20th century term that Emma Goldman used, a spontaneous birth strike but we are all blaming ourselves. We don't see it as the political thing, and we think it's important for us to see it as a political thing and not just think of it as our own personal failings to make it work.
I think that's completely right, because the biggest development among married people now is married people, no children, because they're too expensive. And because everybody gets divorced, really it's more than 50%, because 50% are formally divorced, but then another 20% at least are people who have no kids and no valuable possessions enough to fight over it, so they just split. So you have about 70% of people splitting in a marriage, and women don't want to be left with the kids. And so they're the ones refusing marriage now, particularly among blue-collar women. That's why 42% of kids are born outside of a marriage, whereas in the 50s, it was about 15%. It's huge, and it's an economic issue as well as a social one. And the only way I think they could pull off getting women back is to have a fascist family like they had in Nazi Germany. And even that didn't increase the birth rate because women were wiped out from all the jobs they had to do.
Well, I think it's really interesting as well what you're saying about this particular right-wing think tank, and that they have to change the culture, that there has to be propaganda. I think one of the things that came out from reading the book is just how much the initial sort of women's liberation movement, their demands, how relevant the sort of 7 initial demands are still.
Yeah, right. And how unmet.
And particularly the last one was about, the workers control the profits. That's another sort of rabbit hole to go down. But the thing that is fascinating is you very much outline in your book things that worked and things that work in terms of changing laws, in terms of pushing for a society where abortion is, legal and free and easy, right? And that these certain things that work are just conversations, being able to talk to each other. And exactly like you said, people are sort of, when they're just having the one kid or whatever, they're just sort of seeing it as a personal failure or something, opposed to sort of systemic, like a social issue. And
right.
And on this, I think we should talk about all these things that work to sort of push back and sort of create the world you actually want to live in. But sort of one of the most fascinating things is all the things that don't fit neatly into the right wing's position, right? The one that blew my mind was 7 out of 10 women that get abortions are already mothers.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that, I don't know. It sounds like both Harriet and Ikoi, you knew that. Maybe I'm just being a sort of stupid British person over here, but
no.
Is that a known thing in America?
No, people are very surprised.
I think it's a worldwide, statistic in general. That it's not just an American statistic, if I recall.
Mm.
Well, I think that even Margaret Sanger, as you cited, Jenny, was appealed to by these women who had more children than they could possibly handle.
I mean, the right wing here likes to sort of demonize anyone who wants an abortion, but and I think I may quote in the book this mom who went to get an abortion, and she thought she was like some terrible Medea-like person for wanting to get an abortion, even though she already had a kid. And then she was astonished to read that most people who get abortions in the U.S. and I guess Ikoi says worldwide are people who have kids. So it's part of the propaganda that it's just these careless teenagers or whatever that are getting abortions.
Right.
But clearly it's all kinds of people are getting abortions.
Right.
Well, I would say that the things that worked that we should bring into the current situation in the 60s are what Harriet was talking about. This general uprising was very effective in winning a lot of things because the power structure was frantically trying to peel off different segments of the movement and sort of neutralize them. So, for example, we got the Occupational Safety and Health Act partly because the Nixon administration wanted to appeal to workers in a way that it was losing its chance to appeal to workers. We got abortion. Probably they were trying to get women to calm down, and various other things. So definitely a broad left movement with all of these demands in it was one of the ways that we won. Another way we won is, and this was very clear in the situation with the referendum in Ireland in 2017. So they had bumped along with a sort of abortion reform movement for decades, and basically the content of it was trying to create a few exceptions to the ban on abortion in Ireland. And one of the things was, well, would you have two shrinks sign off on the person was suicidal, or could you just have one shrink sign off on whether? Well, all of these debates about if it was rape, would you have to prove it was rape? Blah blah blah. All of that, we had the same problem in the U.S. We had a small reform movement that went along and tried to change the laws with these little exceptions, but it didn't appeal to the general public because most people didn't think they were going to be in that kind of a situation. And it wouldn't help most people who needed abortions. So it was when the women's liberation movement raised the demand for free abortion on demand, where people saw, oh wow, I could get this. It would be free. This is what I need. That galvanized an enormous uprising on the issue. Same thing happened in Ireland when they went from these small demands to a group of anarcho-feminists in Dublin came up with this idea of free, safe, legal as the demand, and were able to lead the movement into talking about abortion. They named their campaign the Abortion Rights Campaign. They were told, don't use the word abortion, that'll turn people off. They said, no, we have to talk about what we want. And they were able to, and they won overwhelmingly. They were very surprised. They thought it was going to be extremely close. They won by 66% of the vote. After a huge campaign in which they did a lot of door-to-door canvassing. And I think this is important too, getting people to talk about abortion in more than just this very surface sort of moralistic way, and really think about the issues and of course think about all of the people and learn all the people in their lives that have had abortions. That was able to happen in Ireland because of all this canvassing, because it was on the ballot. And we're going to have the opportunity to do that in various states where abortion is going to be on the ballot. So, for example, in Michigan, they're putting it on the ballot. In Kentucky, there's going to be a referendum that is actually anti-abortion, but it's the same conversation, right? Vote against this referendum around abortion in Michigan. So there are going to be all these opportunities to really have deep conversations about what is this about. And I think we also need to include, what is this about in terms of having control of our reproduction when reproductive working conditions are so bad. But that was, I think, that is very effective. And I noticed that when you look at the polling around abortion, in the 90s, there's a big leap in support for abortion rights. And the 90s were when we really went back to doing a lot of mass mobilization around abortion. So it's really effective, and getting people to think about it in ways that they had not thought about it. You think, oh, there's all this abortion rhetoric. Everybody knows everything. They've heard everything about abortion. But it's not really true. They haven't really thought about it in their own sort of context. So that's important. The other part that was incredibly important was the speak outs, people talking about their illegal abortions, getting up, women, whole panels of women saying, we had illegal abortions. Harriet's sister Roz was one of the first people to testify about this. So, like, actually talking about the illegal abortions, and this contradicts everything that we hear in the current sort of liberal version of this, where, oh, abortion is a very private and personal decision. It's between you and your doctor. You shouldn't talk about it in public. You shouldn't be forced to testify about it. Well, obviously, people shouldn't be forced to testify about it. But it's very important that we do testify about it and do talk about it. And that will make it safer for other people to talk about it. And eventually, it will become just this commonplace thing, right? If we're scared to, and if we're shamed into not talking about it, as we are by both liberals and conservatives in this situation, we will still end up with everybody thinking it's something shameful, it's something secret or private. And instead, what we said is the personal is political. We have to make this public. We have to talk about it. And I have to say, shout your abortion. I have to give a lot of kudos to this. Was basically a couple of women who testified about their abortions, and it became this hashtag that went viral, blew up, and thousands and thousands of women testified about their abortions. And so that kind of thing, we need to do more of that to give people who are feeling shame the sense that, oh, no, this is not something that I should have to keep secret.
That's right. I think that's huge. I also think that, one of the things that's in our favor these days, and that the Supreme Court is reacting against as it's progressive, is that religion is much less popular than it has ever been, particularly among young people. And the kind of misogyny that evangelical religions espouse, like the Southern Baptist Conference on Men and Women, and they are the largest Protestant denomination, says that women should be subordinate to men, men should be protective of women, women should be subordinate. They should never be your boss or anything like that if you're a man. And yet, probably because they're always caught literally with their pants down over and over again. Jerry Falwell liking to watch his wife have sex with the pool boy and investing in the pool boy's gay club. And the guy from Liberty University Board of Trustees who died with a dildo up his ass and a rubber suit, which didn't look good for the church. All, their expose as perverts hasn't helped, and their numbers are dwindling, and so are the Catholic churches, with the expose starting in the year 2000 and increasing even in South America, of their sexual predations against children. And I think that the moral high ground.
This was very important in the Irish case, because they had exposed both the sexual abuse of children and the Magdalene laundries where women were right, and then also this horrible operation that they forced on people, where they basically break your pelvis in order to allow the baby through, right, instead of a cesarean. So all of that really made the church, and they had also just won a marriage equality referendum, so that gave people hope. So very much like church, people may still, have beliefs and religion, but they were very anti-clerical at that point. So that was a very important thing, and I think it's got to have been true as well to some extent in Argentina.
Oh yes,
But I think also that there's a great bit in your book, Fred. It's not a testimonial as such, but it was somebody talking about working in an abortion clinic, and that they were fully aware that there were Catholics going in there for abortions, and that there was a sort of they saw themselves as the exception to the rule, like that, you know, they were doing the responsible thing or something like that. And that,
it's worse. It's worse than that. The actual picketers that were picketing the clinic would bring in their daughters to another clinic across town to get abortions, or anti-abortion women who were actually active in the movement would come and get their own abortions, and they always thought, oh well, they were the exception and all of these other people were terrible, but they had real reasons to have an abortion. And the clinic staff would say, no, you have exactly the same reasons that all these other people do.
Right. I mean, that's a very, very common thing. You know, I mean, I when I was in school in Orange County, which is, you know, very conservative county in Southern California, right between LA and San Diego. But, you know, I used to be very active with doing like sex ed and, you know, abortion rights and whatnot on campus. And, you know, I would, you know, often have, you know, some of the members of the anti-abortion groups sometimes take me aside going like, hey, can you give me information for a friend?
Right, always for a friend.
You know, it's that, you know, for a friend, or, you know, one of them, you know, was honest and was just like, you know, I'm in a, you know, kind of a bad situation, you know, and I would always provide them information, you know, and be like, hey, like, you know, I hope this changes your position on this issue, because, you know, same thing. Everyone is, you know, like you know, people have abortions because they're protecting their future. They're protecting, you know,
their family, even they're protecting
their family, their life. I mean, you know, various reasons, right?
There's a great quote in the book. Having an abortion made me happy. I was not forced to become a mother. And the idea of testimonials being really sort of powerful, people sharing those stories, people sharing stories like the you know, working in an abortion clinic and seeing these people come in. And then also, you know, statements like that. I've never heard that in an abortion debate. But then, you know, it's not surprising. I'm, you know, a dude in Britain, and I'm sort of not fully clued up really until reading this book. But I was like, wow, like immediately there's some part of my brain that was like, okay, that's got to be the title of the trailer or the episode, because that would just make everyone really mad.
Well, I mean, that was one of the major aspects of abstinence only sex ed, I think, in terms of, you know, when you're talking about the culture of being able to discuss these things, you know, did, I think, really set back an entire generation.
Yes, it did, but only among the really religious. And I think
No, not at all. Not at all. I absolutely disagree with that.
So hang on. So what was the point?
The abstinence only sex education that was in schools.
Right. And that basically shames people, right?
Well, it doesn't only shame people. I mean, like, you know, the gay men has usually, for the longest time, has been a really strong supporter of reproductive rights. You know, back in the 80s and 90s, and, you know, early aughts, like when I was very active in the issue, was like very, very common to see like many gay men, and to this day, the older gay men are, but a lot of the younger gay men aren't, because they've been subjected to abstinence only sex ed at schools.
And yet they're not abstinent. And I have read that in the schools where they teach abstinence only, there's a much higher teen pregnancy rate.
There is, but there is a, you know, so absolutely, it has nothing to do with abstinence. I'm just saying it creates a, you know, if you're going to talk about the culture of, you know, it created a lot of shame about abortion, about birth control, about people, you know, also not knowing any basics about their bodies. And I mean, it's kind of hard to sometimes, you know, like you have to do a lot of explaining and informing because it's really common when I talk to people that they don't understand the difference between a birth control pill, a morning after pill, and an abortion pill.
Right.
Yeah.
And they need to
Yeah.
know. But I think that,
and this is even the New York Times gets this wrong, I have to say, from watching the discussions of the morning after pill and the abortion pill. Even journalists are guilty of this. It's
right. Which is, it's not that it's not that difficult they're the birth control pill and the morning after pill are somewhat like more closely related together in terms of actual pharmaceutical product.
Yes.
Right. But yeah, it's kind of, there has been a huge gap of, over 10 years because abstinence only sex education still happens, pretty regularly in public schools. But, of just being able to, none of these programs ever mentioned abortion at all.
and look, there's only 17 states in the United States that have biologically correct sex education. So we're really talking about a desert here. But I think a very important thing is the invocation of religion. And the Supreme Court passed 3 pro-religion rules also. Parochial schools can now get public money, and people can pray. That football coach can pray on the football field and so on. And that it was not illegal to have a Christian flag outside of the State House in Boston, that they are trying to push religion, which also pushes shame on women. And, the only really good woman in Catholicism is the Virgin Mary, who never had sex. And so, women, that's so much for women's sexuality. And women are constantly being humiliated and punished for their sexuality in the Bible and the Quran. And so by pushing religion, you push shame on women. However, as these organized formal religions fade among young people, religion too is losing its clout. And I think they're panicked about that and want to reinvoke religion to teach women to be ashamed and responsible for men's transgressions as they were in Genesis, and have their husbands rule over them, as it says in Genesis. So there is a whole right-wing movement here.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And that goes to kind of what the American Enterprise Institute guy was talking about. Is like, we have to somehow create a world in which people think that this is what they should be doing, having kids, being in a family, having large families. Since we don't have the economic support for that, they're having to gin that up pretty far in order to make any difference. But that is definitely the thing. And it's interesting because there were thousands and thousands of clergy in the late 60s. Starting in 1967, there was the Clergy Consultation Service for Abortion, which did abortion referrals to illegal, basically all abortion was illegal at that point. So to doctors, they referred across state lines, hoping that would keep the prosecutions down. And it did help a little bit. But basically, they relied on these doctors who were willing to risk their practices providing abortions. But they were in almost every state. They were doing counseling and basically a referral service. And this was all, progressive clergy and rabbis and just a bunch of clergy. And where are they right now, right? Where is the pro-choice religious community? I'm sure they're out there, making a lot of noise. But we need to encourage that because, that's the answer to this, right?
That's part of the answer. Totally.
Yeah, exactly. So, and they were very brave about it. And I think that whole idea of a clergy consultation service for abortion could be could be gotten back up again, because if you're in an illegal state, you're going to need help getting to a legal state to get abortion, and why not have a clergy consultation service? Yeah.
Well, they do have other sources plus transportation and payment for your abortion across state lines, but it doesn't have the religious power behind it. However, I do think
people might not know how to get to it, right? So
that's true.
There have to be a lot of different angles so that this is really available to the maximum number of people. It's going to be an information war in many ways, not to mention the price, right? And some people can't leave, to fly to New York. They have kids. They have to figure out childcare. They might not trust the people that they're, they might not have a trustworthy person to give childcare. It's like all kinds of stuff that you have to arrange in order to just pick up and leave. And so the other thing that's different from the 60s is the availability of abortion pills. So aid access, which is based in Austria, will do consultations with you by email, text, and phone, and then they will send you the pills from India. They send them into all states in the U.S. It doesn't matter what the laws are. So if people are interested, they should go to aidaccess.org to find out. They're also doing advanced provision so that you could have the pills to give to friends if they need them. And then plancpills.org does trainings for ambassadors of information on the abortion pill, what's available, how you can get it, the cheapest options and the most reliable. plancpills.org, I highly recommend them. They're very organized. And they actually do have a scorecard of various places you can get the pills. How fast will it be? What's the expense and all of that? So there are a lot more options and a lot lower barriers to entry than there were in the 60s for actually providing abortion services. In the 60s, you actually had to know how to do a procedural abortion in order to provide that. Now we have all these other options. And I should mention that the second pill in the abortion pill combination, misoprostol, is also effective on its own. It's much 85% effective, and it's much cheaper. It's sells under the brand name Cytotec. It's often prescribed to protect your stomach if you're taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatories and keep you from getting an ulcer from that. So we have, and that pill is available. It's over the counter in Mexico, and is available in flea markets in Texas and whatnot. So there are a lot of options that we have right now that we never had in the previous period, which make it even less likely that they're actually going to be successful in raising the birth rate through this. They're just going to make a lot of people miserable.
And this conversation continues for another 30 minutes on our Patreon. So why not join us over at patreon.com/It's Not Just In Your Head. Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons: Alex Placito, Bruce Rogers Vaughan, Jennifer Cox, Justin Harper, Rebecca Johns, Seamus O'Connell, and Sheena Belmas.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.